Glad to be back with you tonight. We're going to continue where we left off last week because, surprise, surprise, we didn't get finished with everything that I had in my notes for us to talk about. One of those topics where you all had a lot to discuss, and I'm glad for that. Let's see if I can get this to move forward. We started last week talking about rebellion in the wilderness. We're going story by story through.
Do you want it looking like that?
No, I don't want it looking like that. Thank you. There we go. That's nicer. All right.
Sorry.
My graphics aren't fancy, but the least they can do is show up when they're supposed to, or the way they're supposed to. We started talking about the rebellion in the wilderness. We've been going story by story through the scriptures. So you'll find there's a lot in these first 5 books of the Bible that we skip over, not because they're unimportant, but because we're focused on the stories. If you understand the stories and how they fit together, you can go back and fill in the gaps with the other stuff. For example, if you just read the law in the book of Deuteronomy and try to figure out why things are the way they are in the book of Acts, they don't necessarily, what am I trying to say? Fit together is not the right word, but they're different worlds. They're different worlds, and so it helps us to understand how these stories fit together. We came out of Egypt with the Israelites, and we spent a couple of weeks talking about how God gave them the law and what His intention was for them with the law, what parts of that apply to us today and in what way. And then immediately, we started last week seeing how immediately we think there's a big gap in between these stories, but it was immediate that after God gave the Israelites the law, they started rejecting the law and disobeying. Right? The story kind of reads like God was partway through revealing the law to Moses on the mountain when they begin to hear the noise of war in the camp because the Israelites are down there building a golden calf. Like one of the top 10 things He told them not to do, and they're down there already doing it. So we started talking about this period of rebellion. This is not the only time in Israel's history that they will rebel, but it's sort of the big cluster of rebellions coming right out of Egypt. Now, we looked at some of these last week, and we'll summarize them again just because if you're like me, you've slept a little since then. A little. And it kind of messes with your memory. So we'll summarize those again just so we remember. But we're going to look at the other 3 stories that we didn't get to last week. But we started talking about these last week, and there was some discussion about why God was so, we might say, harsh in some of His responses to these things. The first story we talked about was 2 young men named Nadab and Abihu. And what was their job? Do you remember?
Priests.
They were priests, okay? And who was their dad? Aaron. Very good. So they were the priests. They were some of the priests. They were sons of Aaron. And they showed up to work one day. And what were they supposed to do?
Wait on God to send the fire.
They were supposed to wait on God to send the fire for the offering that they were going to make. And what did they do instead? Did it themselves. They brought their own fire. Some translations call it strange fire. The New King James we were looking at last week said profane fire. So they brought this fire that they weren't supposed to bring. And do you remember how God responded to that?
Yeah, He incinerated them both.
Incinerate is a great word. Great word. God said, oh, here's your fire. There you go. Now to us, that kind of seems like an extreme response, doesn't it? I mean, I'm not saying God is wrong. If by definition, if God does it, it's not wrong. But to us, it kind of seems like an extreme response. Then you contrast it with what I was talking about Sunday night with David in the time of Abiathar, the high priest. He went and ate the showbread he wasn't supposed to. I mean, why did God not bake him into a nice little loaf Himself when He incinerated Nadab and Abihu? That's a hard question to answer. Somebody last week brought something up that I think comes the closest, in my opinion, to answering the question of any answer that I've heard. And I can't remember who said it. But somebody was talking about them having just come out of Egypt after 400 years and them having learned the ways of Egypt and the ways of the gods of Egypt. And maybe God had to be harsh in the beginning for them to get the idea of obedience. Sort of like when I was teaching, you started out the year mean and got nicer gradually. Because if you started out the year nice, the kids would just, you worked for them, right?
Yeah.
Bonnie, are you the one who told me don't smile till Christmas? Yeah. I'd never heard that until I came here, but that sort of summarized my theory
That
of...
wasn't my idea. That was the instructor at Cameron telling me
Oh, okay.
what to do on the first day of school.
Instructor at
Kick the
Cameron.
wastebasket and don't smile till Christmas.
What was the first part?
Kick the wastebasket.
Kick the wastebasket.
Metal
Yes,
wastebasket.
yeah. Kick the wastebasket and don't smile until Christmas.
I like that.
I didn't know about that. My approach was to walk in, being a French teacher, walk in and start barking orders at them in a language they didn't understand until they got silent, But, that's sort of the approach. You start out hard so they understand what's expected of them, and then grace enters into the picture. And I think the idea, whoever said it last week, might have been Rick, whoever said it last week about them just coming out of Egypt and God needing to retrain them, that's the best explanation I can come up with. I didn't come up with it, but that's the best explanation in my mind as to why God reacted so strongly to what we would say was relatively minor rebellion in the beginning. And could also be that the condition of their hearts was different. David was not trying to be disobedient. He was in a life and death situation. Nadab and Abihu, according to some of the notes somebody looked at, may have shown up at work drunk, which tells you how much respect they had for what they were doing to serve God. And I'd never thought about that, but that explains why God immediately turns around and tells Aaron, don't drink strong drink, you or your sons. I always thought that was really random for God to say that, but if it was in reaction to what they had done, maybe they showed up with the strange fire because they were drunk and it did something with their inhibitions, so they weren't making... Do people tend to make good decisions when they're drunk? No. So maybe that's what happened there. Yes, sir.
Was there a certain way that they did fire that was more pure, the way they had to go through a procedure of doing it?
I don't know that it was more pure, but there was a fire on one of the altars that they were supposed to wait for and use, and somehow God provided that fire. And it sounds like they just brought their own from home. and so I don't think it was a problem that, it's the wrong fire. I think it was the condition of the heart that represented, that they were so willing to use whatever fire they just had. They were being sloppy about God's work. They just weren't following the instructions. So.
Well, they were priests, so if they didn't follow the instructions,
Right.
then the odds of the congregation following them are slim and none.
Right.
And Slim's driving the bus to El
Right.
Paso.
Right.
So
That's true. If the religious leaders aren't going to follow what they're supposed to do, how can you expect the congregation to? So God had to nip that in the bud.
David ate the showbread, but he was trying to feed his troop.
That's true.
He wasn't just there. Look what I got for us to eat.
Yeah.
He was trying to provide for the.
Abiathar approved that also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He gave it to them to eat.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it was justified.
Right. Yeah. And I think Nadab and Abihu, I may have talked about this a little bit last week too, but I think Nadab and Abihu, I think there's a caution in there for us that if you're going to be in leadership and in leadership in ministry, in leadership among God's people, you can't get so full of yourself that you think you can just do whatever you want because you're God's gift to everybody. And these men in ministry that get caught up in stupid things, I think a lot of stupid things they should never have been messing with. I think a lot of it starts with thinking they're bigger than they are, believing their own press, as I've heard people say. That's why I'm grateful for a family that keeps me humble and points out my mistakes. Anyway, that was a joke. So the next thing we looked at, and I feel like I'm doing more teaching than summarizing again. We'll move through this quickly, but I'm fascinated by the Nadab and Abihu story. So the next thing was that the Israelites complained. They complained about the manna that God provided. God wasn't happy about that because they were being so ungrateful. And so he said, okay, if you're not happy with what I've provided you, then I'm going to provide you something else. And they went out, those that were driven by their cravings more than their faithfulness to God, went out and hunted these quail, and they came down with some kind of horrible sickness while they were still eating the meat. I mean, it was instant. And God punished them for that. Then we had the story of Aaron and Miriam in Numbers chapter 12 that decided that they could speak for God just as well as Moses could. If he can, why not us? And part of that was motivated by them being upset that Moses had married an Ethiopian. They were upset about that, and they said, if Moses can do it, we can do it. And God said, no, I talked to a lot of people, but I brought Moses into my confidence in a way that I don't bring most people. So what they were really doing was rebelling against God. And that brings us to the story of the 12 spies. We're going to be in Numbers chapter 13 and 14 for this. So they were getting close to the promised land. They'd only been wandering in the wilderness for a few months. And even at that, it seems like a long journey to go from Egypt across the Red Sea through probably what's now Saudi Arabia. The maps at the back of your Bible are probably very wrong. I mean, just most of the Bible maps I've ever seen in the backs of the Bible on the Exodus bear no resemblance to what the Bible says happened. I don't know where they come up with what they come up with. Some of them will show you, I told you the story about the Reed Sea and the liberal professor saying it was only 3 feet of water. And the person saying, well, it's a miracle because God drowned Pharaoh's army in 3 feet of water. It's not sure which is more miraculous at that point. Some of your maps will just show the Reed Sea route. Or I've even seen maps in reputable translations of the Bible that show a possible route where they don't cross any body of water at all. So anyway, just said that to say your maps are not inspired by God. They're a good tool, but trust but verify on your maps. Anyway, so they went up through this area. It shouldn't necessarily have taken them months if they went straight through, but they were following the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. They were being led by God's Spirit. So they're getting close to entering into the promised land here in Numbers chapter 13. And God told Moses that, he said, I've already given this land to you. You'll notice nowhere in here does God tell them, go see if you can take the land. God says, I've already given you the land, go check it out. He said, I've given you the land, so Moses, I want you to commission 12 spies to go in and take a closer look at the land and report back to the people. Verses 1 and 2 say, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a leader among them. So they were sent, each of the 12 of them, they were sent into Canaan on kind of a reconnaissance mission. Just go see what's there. And yes, you may need to check out the fortifications because you may need a strategy. Ultimately God's going to lead you, but you need to be aware of what's going on. So God said, go check it out. Go from the south, go to the north, and come back. Go check out everything. Now, again, we need to understand the mission here was not to go see, can we possibly take this? The mission was just to go and get the lay of the land. And so we go to verse 17 here, because in between there's just a long list of the people who went and what families they were part of. Verse 17, it says, then Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, go up this way into the south and go up to the mountains and see what the land is like, whether the people dwell in it are strong or weak, few or many, whether the land they dwell in is good or bad, whether the cities they inhabit are like camps or strongholds, whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are forests there or not. Be of good courage and bring some of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. So God told them what are some of the things God told them to go check out?
See what the people were
Okay, see what the people were like?
Who were there?
Who's there?
What the land was like,
What the land was like?
crops.
Yeah. Crops, forests, cities. Yeah, just a fact-finding mission. Nowhere in here does God say, go see whether you think you can take it or not. God had already given the land to them. God knew they could take it. Of course, God knew what they were going to find there, that the people were going to be maybe a little scary. But this is one of those rubber meets the road moments where they need to demonstrate that they trust God. And I submit to you, God already knew how they were going to respond. But they needed to know where they stood as far as their faith in God. So they were merely sent out to survey the people in the land, and they came back 40 days later, and they told the people of Israel. So that was a pretty thorough mission they went on. They came back 40 days later, and they told the people, they said, this land is amazing. This land is incredible. It's got everything that we could need. It's like when we moved to Lawton, we're like, they've got a Chick-fil-A, and they've got a Whataburger, they've got Atwoods, they've got everything I need to live. It's the promised land, all right? Except I realized after we moved here, there's no Waffle House, but we love it here anyway. Anyway, but it's the promised land. It's got everything. But there's a problem. They said the people that live there are fierce, and they're scary, and there's a lot of them. And so Caleb, who was one of the 12 spies, tried to reassure the people. He tried to rally the people, kind of a rah-rah, we can go and take it kind of thing. But 10 of the 12 spies said that it would be impossible. They said the nation of Israel would be like grasshoppers in the face of giants. And so how do you think the people of Israel responded when you've got 2 saying, we can do this, or better said, God can do this, and you've got 10 saying, oh, it's super scary? How did the people of Israel respond?
That was a Democratic vote. Didn't go.
What's that?
They're going with the majority.
They're going with the majority. And you know, even if the vote had been 10-2 the other way, they might have just gone with the one that suited what they wanted to hear anyway. If they were already inclined to think, this is going to be hard.
We went right back to, we should have just died in Egypt.
Yeah. And we know they were kind of, well, I'd say they were kind of like Eeyore, but that's a slam on Eeyore. their whole thing up to this point is, oh, we should have just died in Egypt instead of here. You know, let's go back and be slaves. It's horrible. Thanks for
waiting
noticing
for 40 days for news too.
Right. That would be rough. There was no Twitter for them to have a moment by moment update on this. They waited 40 days. Do you think they might have also been afraid that those Canaanites ate our spies alive? They're not coming back. I mean, Moses was gone for, a couple days, and they build a calf? It reminds me of that picture of I think I've said this before, that picture of the dog that you see on Facebook that has completely shredded the couch, and the caption says, oh, thank goodness, I thought you were never coming home. You know, it's like, the Israelites reacted like that. So they began to doubt God, and they began to fear the Canaanites more than they trusted God. And so that led them to doubt God. And they complained again about being led into the wilderness to die. Like God hasn't saved their hides numerous times already. They think that God's just going to leave them there. And so many of them tried to formulate a plan to return to Egypt. Let's figure out a way to go back. Let's just go back to Egypt. Let's be done with this. So Joshua and Caleb tried to rally the people again. And we're in chapter 14 now. Chapter 14, verse 7. This is Joshua and Caleb speaking, and they spoke to the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. So they tried to rally the people, and the people threatened them because they had been turned by the testimony of these 10 spies who refused to have trust in God And I think part of their problem started when they went beyond what God told them to do. You know, we have a saying in our house. I tell the kids all the time, no. Answer the question I asked. Right? When I ask who did this and you start talking about who did what downstairs, I automatically think there's something wrong here. You're hiding something, or you're guilty of something, or there's something wrong in here. You know, and we tend to get ourselves in trouble when we try to answer the question that wasn't asked. I remember being, 50, 75 miles into Mexico on a mission trip, and you have to stop at those checkpoints that the federales run, and they get you out and they inspect everything. We're pulling a church van with a big trailer, and they say, "What's in the trailer?" And we say, "Mostly cookies." Well, then they want to see, and they open it up and they see it's mostly cookies, and they seem a little disappointed. We say, "Do you want some?" "No." Just go. You know what you don't do at that point? And we weren't doing anything illegal, but you don't point out, but I do have several $100 US in cash that, we took up a collection to buy goats for these villagers. No. Answer the question that was asked. Their problem was that they were trying to answer a question that wasn't asked, and it got them in trouble. Did God ask them whether they could take the land or not?
No.
No. Again, what did God ask them?
To just check it out.
Just check it out.
Just take a look.
If they had just done what God told them to and had just answered the question, just gone with the mindset of we're going to answer the question that was asked, they wouldn't have gotten themselves in trouble. But they decided we're going to go back to Egypt. We're not doing this. Their trust in God completely fell apart. They're threatening the people who are trying to serve Him, and God was just ready to destroy the Israelites. And I'll just say, I don't fully understand this concept of God saying, "I'm ready to destroy them," and then not. I don't believe God changes His mind, but I think maybe there's something about God that the best way we can understand it is that it's like that. I'll just say it's awfully good for Israel that God and Moses never got on the same page about destroying them at the same time. Moses' response to God was, "But if you destroy them, then the Egyptians and everybody else will say they died because you weren't powerful enough to bring them through the wilderness." And so God decided to let them live, but He wasn't going to bring them into the promised land because of their faithlessness. They still refused to believe. So God said nobody over the age of 20 gets into the promised land. Nobody who's 20 years old or older today gets into the promised land except Joshua and Caleb, who were the two righteous spies who believed God. Everybody else, He said, nobody in Israel is going into the promised land till y'all are dead and gone. Because that whole generation had refused to believe. So Moses informed them that they would wander in the wilderness until all of those who disbelieved had died. So many of the people decided at that point, hey, maybe we should have believed God in the first place. But it was too late. It didn't mean that God wasn't going to love them. It didn't mean that God wasn't going to take care of them, but He was going to withhold this blessing. And so they went, a group of them said, well, God already gave us the land. We'll just go in and take it now. And they all lived happily ever after, right? Wrong. See, there's this group of people called the Amalekites. Do you remember us talking about them before?
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember about the Amalekites?
Giants.
They were feared.
They were feared. I don't remember the giant part. I'll have to go back and look that up.
Anak.
You-
The sons of Anak. Yeah.
Okay.
the Giants.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not saying you're wrong. I don't remember that. Okay. The Amalekites and the Canaanites slaughtered them. The Amalekites, I've told you before, are sort of the mortal enemies of the Jews, to the point that I believe back during the 30s and 40s, there were writings comparing the Nazis to the Amalekites, not to illustrate how bad the Amalekites were, but to illustrate how bad the Nazis were. Because the Amalekites had that reputation previously. So they began their wandering in the wilderness. And by the way, I thought about this too. It seems so harsh that God would say, fine, this whole generation of people are going to die in the wilderness. But the last time I was studying on this, you know what occurred to me? What has that generation of people been asking for this whole time?
Go back to Egypt.
We want to go back to Egypt, or we want to die in the wilderness. We should have just died in the wilderness. Or we should just die in the wilderness. Or they've been complaining that they think that that's what God's going to do. And it's like God said, okay, if you think this is all I'm capable of, no promised land for you. All right. Questions about the 12 spies? And that story is important because it sets the stage for what comes next over the next 40 years. When I was a kid, I thought they wandered 40 years in the wilderness because they were lost. Or it was just that long of a trip. No, they wandered for 40 years in the wilderness because they were in rebellion. All right. So we go to the next story of rebellion. That's Korah's uprising. This is, I don't know why, but this is one of my favorite stories. This is in Numbers chapter 16. There's a man named Korah who was actually a cousin to Moses. And he was also a Levite. He was a leader of people. But he was jealous of Moses. Now, again, why were Aaron and Miriam jealous of Moses?
Because he talked to God.
He talked to God,
talked to him.
and God talked to him. And as a consequence, what did Moses get to do?
He led the folks.
Hmm?
He led them.
He led them. He got to speak for God and lead the people. So Korah does the same thing that Aaron and Miriam did. He started, as a religious leader, started thinking, wow, I'm pretty important, and I can do this job too. So he got together a group of 250 men to go out and confront Moses and Aaron. So rather than accept the fact that God spoke through Moses, they wanted to remove Moses from the position of authority and take that place of honor for themselves. Now, do you remember when we covered the story of how the people of Israel elected Moses to be the leader? Do you remember that story? I'm glad I see puzzled looks. There is no story where... I'm sorry, I always tell you, I don't ask trick questions. I did that time, sorry. There's an exception to everything. There was no story where the Israelites elected Moses to be their... God elected Moses. Thank you.
But then the Israelites kind of said, you go talk to God. We don't want him talking to us.
Right.
So you go do it.
Right. When they got a glimpse of who God was, they were more than willing to let Moses, you just go do that. You take care of that for us. Because it's a fearful thing to stand before a holy God, especially as you see your own sin. So they said, Moses, you go do that. Well, they thought then, Korah and his men thought it was up to them to remove Moses as though they had put him in power in the first place. Look at chapter 16, verse 7. Moses comes up with this contest, presumably being led by God. Actually, let's go back to verse 5. See, Moses hears what they're saying, that they're challenging him, they're wanting to remove him because Korah thinks he can speak to God and speak for God just as well as Moses can. Moses, to his credit, Moses was not a perfect man, but Moses, to his credit, realized this is not about me. This is not about Moses and how spiritual and how important I am. This is about what God wants. So we're going to let God decide. We're going to let God decide. Verse 5 of chapter 16. And he spoke to Korah and all his company. Actually, if you go back to verse 4, I need to make a decision, right? But if you go back to verse 4, it says when Moses heard it, he fell on his face. That's not him throwing a temper tantrum like when Charlie fell on his face out here because we told him he had to come eat.
He was upset.
He
was mad.
He was crying out to God. Yeah, I'm sure he was upset too. Doesn't matter how spiritual you are. Somebody challenges you like that, you're in the flesh. You're going to get a little upset. But he was crying out to God. Mm-hmm. He was lying what's called prostrate, where he's on his face before God. He's praying. He's humbling himself before God. And that's when verse 5 says, he spoke to Korah and all his company, saying, tomorrow morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy, and will cause him to come near to him. That one whom he chooses, he will cause to come near to him. Do this. Take censers. Those are those little hands basically like Nadab and Abihu carried the fire in. Take censers, Korah and all your company, put fire in them and put incense in them before the Lord tomorrow, and it shall be that the man whom the Lord chooses is the Holy One. You take too much upon yourselves, you sons of Levi. Now he says, you get your fire and your incense in your censer and you bring it. And God is going to show who he wants to represent him. God's going to choose. But then he does end it by... we've got to give Moses credit here for saying, it's up to God. He's going to decide. And I'm going to be fine with whatever God decides. But Moses already knows what God has decided. And he says, you Levites, you take too much on yourselves. In Oklahoma, we would say, you're just a little too big for your britches, right? Yeah. That's not an exact translation of the Hebrew, but that's what he's getting at there. And so they have this showdown the next day. God would reveal his choice the next morning. So this next morning, the group comes together like they'd agreed, and God had already warned Moses. He said, Moses, you and Aaron and the people, you need to stay away from Korah and his followers. This is where social distancing was invented, right? He says, you need to get back from them. Moses told the people, he laid out the ground rules of the contest. He said, if the conspirators lived long enough, if Korah and his men lived long enough to die of natural causes, sounds like it's turning into a really long contest. If they live long enough to die of natural causes, then you'll know that God is fine with what they want to do. But if the ground opens up and swallows Korah and his followers alive, then you'll know that God has chosen Moses and that they were actually standing against the will of God. So suddenly, after telling them this and telling everybody to get away from Korah, there's sometimes somebody will say something, there's that joke about get away from them in case the lightning strikes. They're really doing this, get away from them because the ground may open up any moment. It does open up. It's split open right in front of them. It swallowed up Korah and his co-conspirators. They fell into it. Think the final scene of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Okay, when they're in that temple building, I forget what treasury building, and the ground splits open and they all go sliding into the abyss. That really happened here. But as quickly as the earth opened up, it closed behind them. So it's like when God drowned Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea, God drowned Korah's followers in the earth. The Israelites who were watching this, who were just kind of on the sidelines, they were terrified that the earth would open up again and swallow them. And I think as we all would have been terrified about that. They were so afraid they began attacking Moses over what God had done. They're not big enough to go after God, so they're going to go after Moses. So as God watched them rebel against his spokesman again, a plague broke out among the Israelites. And the only thing that spared the people, the only thing that ended the plague, was for Aaron to go and make a sacrifice to atone for the people's sins. But God once again took this concept of rebellion very, very seriously. He opened up the ground and swallowed up Korah's followers. Questions or comments on that? Yes, sir.
I've noticed that God's way of dealing with justice is just so surprisingly beautiful, because when I first lived in Oklahoma, I was part of a church in 9802 in Tulsa, and there became a division in the leadership as well. And it seemed to me that the way God dealt with it was that he had two sides going to do two different directions. Mm-hmm. And it's really funny because the ones that were more inclined to do their own agenda rather than God's, they got split into all the different other states as far away from Oklahoma as you can. Like, there's some on the East Coast and there's some on the West. Mm-hmm. There's none here in Oklahoma at all. Mm-hmm. but the ones that actually did put God first and saw His agenda, they are still in Tulsa. So I thought that was quite interesting when you read about this. It makes me think of that.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you talk to anybody that was on the sidelines, like you say, you get that holy fear. And of course, it's beautiful respect too, because you can see that if you hadn't witnessed it, you would not have known anything like that happened or occurred.
Yeah.
But that purifying process, that pruning process,
Right.
was really quite profound.
Yeah. And that's what a lot of this has to do with is pruning and purifying. Those are good words you used. My next question to you was going to be, why do you think God reacts so strongly when it's the leaders among His people that are rebelling?
They're held to a higher standard.
They're held to a higher standard.
Major influence.
Influence, yeah. They set an example, and if God allows it to go on at the top, people are going to see that and follow suit. It's there's a reason. I know that it's not exactly the same office, but there's a reason why God tells us in the New Testament that not many should desire to be teachers. You know, there's an incredible responsibility there for what you teach and the example you set. And to an extent, that was true in this priestly office as well. They were going to be held to account for what they led God's people to do. All right, you ready for one more story?
Yeah.
All right. Numbers chapter 20. This is the next thing that happened. Now we're into about the 1420s BC. So we're about 20 years after the... We're about 20 years into the wandering, I think. 20 years into the time after the Red Sea parted. Numbers chapter 20. While they were wandering around during the 20 years, they came to an area, I've seen different names for it, even in the same story. Kadesh, Meribah, might be that one is the region, one is the exact place. And when they got there, the people were upset with the conditions again that they were having to endure. And what did the Israelites do when they were unhappy with the conditions they were living in?
Complained to Moses.
They complained. They complained a lot. They complained about being brought into the wilderness to die, yes. And so Moses did what he always did when they complained. He slapped them around a little bit. No, he did not. That might have been what he wanted to do, but no, he went and talked to God, and he sought God's direction. So God told him, take the people back to Meribah. I don't think they were too far away. Take them back to this place where just a few years ago, Moses had struck a rock with his rod, and what had happened? Yeah, not just water, but sweet water, drinkable water, had come out of the rock. That was almost immediately after they had come out of Egypt. So God said, go back to that place. Go back where they can see my provision in their history. This was all about trying to teach Israel to trust Him. Go back to that place where I've provided for them before, where I've provided in these seemingly impossible ways. Go back there. And now Moses had gone and he had struck the rock with his rod. That's what God told him to do the first time. This time, God didn't want him to strike the rock. Do you remember what God wanted him to do?
Speak to the rock.
Speak to the rock. All you've got to do is speak to the rock. I don't know exactly what he had to say, but go and speak to the rock and water will come out. Now, on first glance, I want to say that seems improbable. Just from a human standpoint, seems improbable. The idea that you would speak to a rock, if you take God out of the equation. If you speak to a rock, it's hard to believe that water is just going to come out of it. But it's also hard to believe that if you take God out of the equation, hitting a rock with a rod is going to make the water come out of it. So he's being asked to trust God just as much as he did before. So Moses goes and leads the people to the rock, and all the way that they're out there, he's chastising, he's criticizing the people for their lack of faith. And then he walks up to the rock, And he takes out his rod and he strikes the rock again. Is it my imagination, or did he just do what he got onto the people for doing? Because God said, speak to the rock. And Moses thought, no, I need to do this myself. I need to do what I know works. I know, God, you said to do this, but I know this works. I've seen this way before. So he strikes the rock, and God was gracious because tons and tons of water started gushing out of the rock so that everybody was able to drink. And the people were happy. They had their water. They had what they wanted. But who do you think was unhappy?
God.
God was unhappy. God was unhappy. Moses, even while he was criticizing the people for not trusting God to provide, he had not trusted God to provide, because instead of trusting God to provide the way he said he would, Moses went back to what he thought was going to work. And that looks a lot like not trusting God to do what God said he could do. God thinks he can handle it this way, but I've really got to step in and take care of this for him. After everything he had seen, after being there for all the miracles that God had done, even back to Egypt, and being the one to get so frustrated with his people for their lack of faith, Moses himself even fell into this trap. It's possible for all of us, if we're not on guard against it. We have to be so careful not to fall into this trap of trusting ourselves instead of trusting God. And because of this, God could have reacted in so many ways. God could have punished Moses much more harshly for this. But God's response to this was to tell Moses that he would not be the one to lead Israel into the promised land. It's not that God was going to kill him. God wasn't going to drown him or incinerate him or anything like that. God said, though, you don't get to go into the promised land. Now, why would God choose to discipline Moses that way, do you think?
Disobedience again.
That's what Moses wanted the most.
That's what Moses wanted the most. I bet it was. He's been working toward this for a long time. And it's possible his whole thing about striking the rock again was about him being the leader. I've got to be the one to provide. I've got to, and for him to be the leader, the one who leads them into the promised land, that may have become an idol where God had to take it away from him.
I think God needed to discipline Moses. If he disciplined Moses in the same way he disciplined all those other rebels, the people might have said, well, Moses wasn't all that great after all. So God said, you need to be disciplined, but you were my servant for a long time.
Yeah. Okay.
So I will discipline you, but not in the same way I did the others.
That's a good point. He wasn't. That's an excellent point. He wasn't through using Moses, so he needed to discipline him, but not in a way that would cause the people to think that he was no longer, or to lose what confidence they had in Moses. It's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
But when you go back to Numbers and look at what God said, anybody 20 and over, not going into the promised land. That included Aaron and Moses.
I'm not sure.
At that point
There were
in
some
time.
exceptions.
I'm not sure if it included Moses, because God seemed, you may be right, but it seemed like God almost viewed Moses as an entity separate from Israel. It's like God and Moses and Israel, and they were three entities. I don't know if that makes sense outside of my mind.
He did also exempt Caleb and Joshua.
He did, yeah.
He said, except them.
He didn't specifically exempt Moses, you're right, but it sounds like from this that Moses was just sort of understood to be an exception.
Did God tell that publicly that Moses wasn't going in, or did he just tell Moses?
That's a good question. Let me see.
It says the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron.
Yeah,
Just the two of them.
yeah. So imagine, and that makes me wonder, did Moses go and tell the people, or did he just, they'll find out when I die and then I don't have to answer for it?
I think that his leadership would have been impacted if he told them.
Possibly. Yeah.
Negatively.
Yes. Yes. Why does God not respond to disobedience this way today? And I know God still responds to disobedience. He still disciplines us. But why do we not see... I guess the question a skeptic might ask was, okay, if this is all real, why do we not see the immediate and the just forceful response today that the Israelites saw? Why do you think that is?
Jesus brought us grace.
Okay, Jesus brought us grace. Certainly to God's people, what about those who've not received that grace yet, who've rejected that grace? Why is it not? Why is God not incinerating people and giving them leprosy today as soon as they step out of line?
Because they still have the opportunity until they go meet Him in person. They have the opportunity to accept Him as their Lord and Savior and receive that grace and mercy.
Good.
Just one word, grace.
Grace, yeah. I think, yes, sir.
Well,
I was just going to say, I think it goes to what Peter said, because I think he draws parallels to the Old Testament and says, God is not slack concerning His promises. Like, God has not forgotten His justice. God is not asleep at the switch, but God is merciful and not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Yes, sir.
Moses did make it to the promised land. He showed up on the Mount of Transfiguration.
Yes.
So he finally made it.
Yeah, he eventually did make it. He didn't get... You know what? Let me...
You didn't get to see it.
Okay, yeah. I need to be more precise in my language. It's not that Moses didn't go to the promised land. Moses didn't get to lead them into the promised land. You are right. Yeah. It says he would not bring the assembly in, but he was with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration.
But
That's good.
Neither did God zap most of the congregation that was wandering around in the desert either.
Yeah.
In the wilderness.
Yeah.
Just a select number along the way.
Right.
That He took.
They still had opportunities to serve Him during that 40 years. Yeah. Just one second. Yes, sir. Yeah,
I've just noticed in my own encounters with people that question God's dealings with us, and I try to remind them that the God that you're talking about is not a vending machine God. Mm-hmm. You don't press buttons and then you pop out the candy. He is a holy God. Mm-hmm. And of course, in that first experience with the rock, it just said that He just struck it. Mm-hmm. Now, the second time, that was also, let me back up a little bit. That was to demonstrate God's holiness. And it's different than all other gods that they've known. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, when we jump ahead to that second time, yes, when God wanted to show and establish with this people, I am holy, I am different. Mm-hmm. Apparently, sometimes when the second time is struck twice, it says, not just once. The holiness was not as predominant. Mm-hmm. And I know that even in my people that I talk to, like I said, they think, okay, I'm going to pray, and everything's going to be hunky-dory, I'm going to get my healing and all that. Mm-hmm. God says, wait a minute, I'm holy. All you want is you want to put coins in my machine and get something out. Mm-hmm. I need something else here. I'm supposed to be respected here. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes those second times are needed for that reason.
Yeah. Very good. Yes, sir.
I was going to ask you, do you think He maybe struck the rock instead of talking to it because it was more of like a showmanship?
It's possible. Yeah, I mean, we can have a lot of motivations at the same time, right? We can even have good and bad motivations at the same time. Humans are complex creatures. It could have been this is what I know will work because I've seen it happen. It could have been hey guys, watch this. Yeah, it could have been all of that and more at the same time.
Well, given his words, I think he was just really frustrated and upset with the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And given those words, he said, "Now you rebels, look, must we do this?" And then comes him striking the rock.
Yeah. Yeah, it could have been frustration, and he could have just been carelessness more even than willful disobedience. It's hard to speculate.
Are those wells still producing water today?
I don't know, because there's a lot of debate over where exactly these are located. So I don't know. I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
I was just thinking that God disciplined Moses because it says that he disciplines those he loves. So he has to discipline us because he loves us and he doesn't want us to wander off. Even if you're a leader, you still need discipline at times because, we have to learn. Just because we're in leadership doesn't mean we
Absolutely.
fail no matter what we are, no matter what level. So
Absolutely.
I did out of love for Moses too.
Yeah, the Lord chastens whom He loves, is what it says. That's right. Just like with our kids, my kids are sick of hearing this, I'm sure, but I love you too much to let you act this way. and it's not fun to discipline them, but so I think that was part of it too. I think the way God dealt with Moses not letting him lead them into the promised land, and dealt with this generation of not letting them go into the promised land but not killing them either. I think there's a lesson for us in that too also, that when we mess up, when we fall into disobedience, even when God disciplines us for that disobedience, it doesn't necessarily mean that our service to Him is over. Yeah, there's grace even in the Old Testament, but much more evident in the New Testament. I messed up today. My heart wasn't right. My attitude wasn't right. My words weren't right. But there's grace, and God forgives, and I go on and serve Him tomorrow. It doesn't mean that He zaps me necessarily. And I've heard for years. I'll close on this unless y'all have any more questions or comments. But I've heard for years people say that the rock here at Meribah is a picture of Jesus. Now I've been looking to see if there's any explicit reference to that in the New Testament. There's not one that I recall. If you know of one, let me know. But this would be a reference to Jesus, or God was intending it to be a picture of Jesus, where the first time the rock was struck to bring forth the living water, and God's plan was thereafter the rock would only need to be spoken to. Jesus doesn't need to be struck. He doesn't need to be crucified. He doesn't need to be offered on the altar over and over and over again for us to receive the living water. He was struck once and now only needs to be spoken to. Do you have a reference on that? I saw your hand.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians chapter 10.
1 Corinthians.
About verse 4, somewhere around on there, it says that rock was Jesus.
That rock was Jesus. Okay, I looked and looked. 1 Corinthians chapter. And I was even in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 today on another project I was working on. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Absolutely. There it is. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Verse 4, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ.
So that was the best explanation I ever heard. If the Old Testament is a shadow of the New Testament, take all that and apply. Jesus was to be crucified once. And when Moses repeated the striking, that's wrong. You can't God never agreed with that. So same thing now.
Absolutely.
That's my opinion.
I think you're right.
You take that to find all and you knock that off.
Well, if you and I have the same opinion, we're probably right then. I can't imagine both of us being wrong at the same time.